The auctioneer's hammer fell with a sound that echoed through the dusty courthouse square like a gunshot, sealing a transaction that would change the course of Western history in ways no one could have imagined. Ezra Thompson stood frozen among the crowd of bidders, his calloused hands trembling as he realized what he'd just done. 7 pairs of frightened eyes stared at him from the auction block, children ranging in age from 6 to 15, orphaned by the cholera epidemic that had swept through Colorado territory like wildfire. Now legally his responsibility for the sum of $43.60. It was every penny he had in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The year was 1867, and Willow Creek, Colorado Territory, was a town barely clinging to existence in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains. What had started as a promising mining settlement 3 years earlier had devolved into a collection of weathered buildings and broken dreams after the silver veins played out sooner than expected. Most of the prospectors had moved on to newer strikes in Nevada and California, leaving behind a scattered population of stubborn souls who refused to abandon what little they'd managed to build. Ezra Thompson was one of those stubborn souls, though his stubbornness came not from pride, but from a complete lack of alternatives. At 31 years old, he owned 160 acres of land that the territorial government had been eager to give away to anyone willing to homestead. In such a remote location, the property came with a ramshackle cabin, a barn that leaked in 17 different places, and soil that seemed designed by nature to test a man's faith in divine providence. He'd arrived in Willow Creek 2 years earlier with nothing but a worn-out horse, a set of farming tools inherited from his father, and the kind of desperate optimism that drove men to seek their fortunes in places where other people feared to tread. Back in Ohio, Ezra had been a schoolteacher in a small farming community, respected for his education and his gentle way with children who struggled with their letters and numbers. But when the war ended and displaced veterans flooded the job market, there wasn't room for a soft-spoken pedagogue who'd spent the conflict teaching instead of fighting. The decision to head west hadn't been entirely voluntary. Emily Richardson, the banker's daughter he'd been courting for 3 years, had made it clear that she needed a husband with better prospects than a teacher's modest salary could provide. Her father had been even more direct, suggesting that perhaps Ezra might find opportunities elsewhere that would allow him to make something of himself before returning to claim his daughter's hand in marriage. So Ezra had sold everything he owned, purchased a homestead claim from a land agent who painted glowing pictures of Colorado Territory's agricultural potential, and set off to build the kind of life that would prove him worthy of Emily's affections. The reality he'd encountered bore little resemblance to the agent's descriptions. The growing season was shorter than he'd expected, the soil was rockier, and the isolation was more complete than anything he'd experienced during his orderly life in Ohio. For 2 years, Ezra had struggled to coax crops from reluctant earth while sending carefully optimistic letters back to Emily, describing his progress in terms that emphasized potential rather than actual results. He'd managed to grow enough vegetables to feed himself and trade for basic supplies, but the corn and wheat he'd hoped would provide cash crops had been disappointing failures. His cattle herd consisted of 3 cows and a bull purchased with money he couldn't afford to spend, and his attempts at raising chickens had been frustrated by predators that seemed to view his henhouse as a convenient buffet. The loneliness had been almost as challenging as the practical difficulties of frontier farming. Ezra's nearest neighbor lived 8 miles away, and visits to town were rare events that required half a day's travel each direction. During the long winter months, he sometimes went weeks without speaking to another human being, carrying on conversations with his livestock that grew more elaborate as the isolation wore on his nerves. But it was the children's auction that had brought everything into sharp focus, forcing Ezra to confront the gap between the life he'd planned and the man he'd actually become. The cholera outbreak had struck Willow Creek in late spring, arriving with a family of settlers who'd picked up the disease during their journey from Kansas. Within 6 weeks, 37 people had died, including most of the town's families with young children. The epidemic had burned itself out as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a collection of traumatized survivors and 7 children who no longer had parents to care for them. In a larger town with more established institutions, the orphans might have been sent to relatives or placed in an orphanage, run by religious organizations equipped to handle such tragedies. But Willow Creek had no such resources, and the territorial government solution was characteristically practical: auction the children to local families, willing to take responsibility for their care in exchange for their labor until they reached adulthood. The announcement had appeared in the town's weekly newspaper, describing the auction in the same matter-of-fact language used to advertise livestock sales or farm equipment. 7 children, ages 6 through 15, would be offered to responsible bidders who could demonstrate their ability to provide food, shelter, and basic education. The winning bidders would gain legal guardianship and the right to the children's labor in exchange for meeting their needs until they turned 18. Ezra had read the notice 3 times before its implications fully registered. Children, actual human beings, were being sold like cattle to whoever could afford to feed them. The practical part of his mind understood the logic behind such arrangements. Frontier communities couldn't afford the luxury of institutions dedicated to child welfare, and orphaned children needed families willing to take them in. But his former teacher's instincts rebelled against the casual way the auction reduced young leaves to economic transactions. He'd planned to attend the auction as an observer, telling himself that his presence was necessary to ensure the children were placed with decent families rather than opportunists looking for cheap labor. Ezra had no business bidding on children when he could barely support himself, and the rational course of action was to hope that more prosperous members of the community would step forward to do their Christian duty. But when auction day arrived, the crowd gathered in the courthouse square was smaller and less charitable than he'd hoped. Most of the bidders were local business owners looking for workers they wouldn't have to pay wages, or farmers who needed extra hands during harvest season and saw the orphans as a solution to their labor problems. The children themselves stood on a makeshift platform, looking terrified and bewildered, clutching each other for comfort, while strange adults discussed their futures in terms of work capacity and feeding costs. The oldest was a boy named Marcus Williams, 15 years old, with the kind of lean build that suggested he'd already learned to go hungry when food was scarce. His dark hair fell across intelligent brown eyes that showed no tears, but plenty of wariness as he listened to men debate whether he was old enough to handle heavy farm work or if his youth made him a poor investment. Beside him stood his sister Sarah, 13 years old, with the same dark hair and a protective stance that suggested she'd been looking after the younger children since their parents died. The middle group consisted of twin boys named Daniel and David Cooper, both 11 years old and nearly identical except for a scar on Daniel's forehead where he'd fallen from a tree the previous summer. They stood close together, whispering in the private language that twins sometimes develop, their blue eyes wide with confusion at finding themselves the subject of adult negotiations they couldn't understand. The youngest 3 broke Ezra's heart most completely. Emma Patterson was 9 years old, a blonde girl with pigtails who kept asking in a small voice when her mama was coming back. 7-year-old James Murphy had red hair and freckles that made him look even younger than his actual age, and he'd been crying quietly since the auction began. The youngest was Lucy Hayes, barely 6 years old, who clung to Sarah Williams with the desperate intensity of a child who'd learned that the adults she'd trusted to keep her safe could disappear without warning. As the bidding began, Ezra watched with growing horror as the children were discussed like livestock being evaluated for purchase. Tom Bradley, who owned the town's largest general store, Bid $20 for Marcus Williams alone, explaining to his wife that a strong boy could handle deliveries and stock work without requiring wages. Mrs. Henderson, the widow who ran the boarding house, expressed interest in Sarah Williams as kitchen help, but balked at taking responsibility for any of the younger children, who couldn't earn their keep immediately. The most disturbing moment came when Jake Morrison, a rancher with a reputation for working his hired hands to exhaustion, bid $15 for the Cooper twins, while making it clear he had no intention of providing them with the education required by territorial law. Morrison's ranch was 20 miles from town, far enough away that no one would monitor how he treated the boys, and his dismissive comments about book learning being unnecessary for farm work made his intentions obvious. That was when something inside Ezra Thompson snapped. The careful calculations about his limited resources and uncertain future disappeared, replaced by memories of his classroom back in Ohio, where he'd watched children's faces light up when they finally understood a difficult concept. These weren't commodities to be purchased by whoever offered the highest bid. They were young human beings who deserved better than being separated and sold to masters who saw them only as sources of labor. Without fully conscious decision, Ezra found himself raising his hand. $40, he called out, his voice carrying across the courthouse square with surprising authority. For all 7 children, together. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of wind rustling through the cottonwood trees that lined the town's main street. Tom Bradley turned to stare at Ezra with obvious disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process what he'd heard. Mrs. Henderson whispered something to her neighbor that sounded like a question about Ezra's sanity. Even the auctioneer seemed momentarily confused by a bid that grouped all the children together, rather than allowing them to be split up among different buyers. $40 for the lot? The auctioneer repeated, as if giving Ezra a chance to reconsider such an obviously foolish offer. That's 7 children, Mr. Thompson. Are you certain you understand what you're bidding on? Ezra felt every eye in the courthouse square focused on him, and for a moment his resolve wavered. $40 represented most of his remaining cash, money he'd been saving to purchase seed for next spring's planting and supplies to repair his barn before winter arrived. Taking responsibility for 7 children would transform his already difficult situation into something that bordered on impossible. But then he looked at the children standing on the platform and saw Sarah Williams squeeze little Lucy Hayes' hand while whispering something that was probably reassurance about staying together. He saw the Cooper twins holding onto each other like they were afraid someone might try to separate them. He saw Marcus Williams's attempt to stand straight and look capable despite the fear in his eyes, and Emma Patterson's confused expression as she tried to understand why strangers were arguing about taking her away from the only other children who'd shared her loss. $43.60, Ezra said firmly, reaching into his pocket to produce the leather pouch that contained every cent he possessed in the world. That's my final bid, and it's contingent on keeping all 7 children together as a family. The auctioneer looked around the courthouse square, searching for other bidders who might challenge such an unusual offer. Tom Bradley shook his head and walked away, unwilling to spend more than $20 for a single boy when he could hire adult workers for seasonal labor. Jake Morrison spat into the dust and declared that he'd find farmhands elsewhere rather than deal with city folk and their fool notions about keeping families together. Sold, the auctioneer declared, bringing his hammer down with the decisive sound that sealed Ezra's fate. 7 children to Ezra Thompson for $43.60, with the understanding that they'll remain together under his guardianship. As the crowd began to disperse, Ezra approached the platform where 7 pairs of eyes watched him with expressions ranging from hope to terror. He'd just committed himself to feeding, clothing, housing, and educating 7 children, with resources that had been barely adequate for supporting one adult. Winter was coming. His crops had been disappointing, And he had no idea how he was going to fulfill the obligations he'd just undertaken. But looking at those children, seeing the relief in Sarah Williams's eyes when she realized they wouldn't be separated, watching little Lucy Hayes stop crying for the first time since the auction began, Ezra knew he'd made the only choice his conscience would allow. Whatever came next, whatever challenges and hardships lay ahead, he would face them with 7 young souls who deserved a chance to grow up together as a family. The walk back to his ranch that afternoon became a solemn procession. 7 children, carrying their few possessions in cloth bundles, followed behind Ezra's wagon, their footsteps raising small clouds of dust in the warm October air. No one spoke much during the 5-mile journey. The children were still processing their change in circumstances, and Ezra was beginning to comprehend the magnitude of what he'd committed himself to accomplish. As they crested the hill that overlooked his property, Ezra saw his homestead through their eyes for the first time. The cabin he'd been gradually improving over 2 years suddenly looked impossibly small for 8 people. The barn that had seemed adequate for his modest livestock herd would need significant expansion to house the additional animals required to support a larger household. Even the vegetable garden that had provided enough food for 1 person would need to be doubled or tripled in size to feed 8 mouths through the coming winter. But there was something else in that moment, something that caught Ezra by surprise. As he watched 7 orphan children get their first glimpse of what might become their home. For the first time since leaving Ohio, the isolated ranch didn't feel empty. The silence that had been his constant companion for 2 years was broken by Sarah Williams explaining to little Lucy that the chickens in the yard wouldn't hurt her, by the Cooper twins arguing quietly about which one would get to help with the horses, by Marcus Williams asking practical questions about where everyone would sleep and what chores needed to be done before dark. They were questions that would require immediate answers, problems that would demand solutions Ezra didn't yet possess. But they were also signs of life returning to a place that had been defined by loneliness for too long. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction was about to discover that sometimes the greatest investments are the ones that make no financial sense but perfect human sense. As evening approached and the Rocky Mountains cast long shadows across the homestead, Ezra Thompson stood on his porch watching 7 children explore their new surroundings with the careful curiosity of young people trying to understand where they belonged in an uncertain world. Tomorrow would bring the first of countless challenges as he learned to transform his bachelor existence into something resembling a family. But tonight, for the first time since leaving Ohio, his ranch felt like it might actually become a home. The auctioneer's hammer had fallen. The transaction was complete, and what came next would either prove Ezra Thompson a fool who doomed himself and 7 innocent children to failure, or a man whose moment of costly compassion would indeed make history in the American West. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The morning sun had barely crested the eastern ridge when Ezra discovered that 7 children could generate more chaos in 10 minutes than he'd experienced in 2 years of solitary ranch life. Little Lucy Hayes had somehow managed to open the chicken coop during her exploration of the property, sending 12 angry hens scattering across the yard in a flurry of feathers and indignant squawking. The Cooper twins were chasing the escaped birds with enthusiastic determination but questionable technique, their efforts creating more confusion than containment. Meanwhile, Emma Patterson sat on the porch steps crying because she'd torn her only dress on a protruding nail, and James Murphy had disappeared entirely, prompting Sarah Williams to organize a search party among the older children. Ezra stood in his doorway holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, watching what appeared to be his carefully ordered existence dissolving into complete pandemonium. The rational part of his mind, the part that had always solved problems through methodical analysis and careful planning, suggested that perhaps he'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. But another part of him, a part that had been dormant since his teaching days in Ohio, found something oddly familiar and even comforting about the organized chaos of children being children. "Mr. Thompson." Sarah Williams called from behind the barn, her voice carrying the note of urgency that immediately commanded adult attention. "You need to see this." Ezra set down his coffee and followed the sound of her voice, stepping carefully around scattered chickens and dodging Daniel Cooper, who was pursuing a particularly stubborn hen with single-minded determination, behind the barn. He found Sarah standing beside a discovery that explained James Murphy's disappearance and revealed something important about the red-haired 7-year-old's character. James had found the ranch's most persistent problem, a section of fence where cattle regularly broke through to escape into the neighboring valley. The boy was crouched beside the damaged posts, running his small hands over the splintered wood, with the kind of focused attention that suggested genuine interest rather than idle curiosity. More remarkably, he'd somehow located Ezra's toolbox and was attempting to understand how the fence could be repaired, holding a hammer that was nearly as big as he was. "I know about fixing things," James said quietly when he noticed Ezra watching him. "My papa taught me before he got sick. This fence is broke because the posts ain't deep enough and the wires stretch too tight for winter weather." The assessment was surprisingly accurate for a 7-year-old, revealing both practical intelligence and exposure to farm work that most children his age wouldn't possess. Ezra knelt beside James and examined the fence with fresh eyes, seeing problems he'd been postponing for months because he lacked the time and resources to address them properly. "You're right about the posts," Ezra admitted. "But fixing it properly would require digging new holes and setting posts deeper than I can manage by myself." "I could help," James offered with the earnest enthusiasm of a child eager to prove his worth. "And Marcus is strong. Sarah knows about lots of things too. We could all help." The simple offer contained layers of meaning that took Ezra by surprise. These weren't just children he'd rescued from an unfortunate situation. They were individuals with skills and knowledge and a willingness to contribute to solving problems they recognized as important. The fence represented more than a minor inconvenience. It was a symbol of the challenges that had been overwhelming him as a single homesteader, but might be manageable for a family working together. Over the next hour, as Ezra helped round up the escaped chickens and dealt with Emma's torn dress and Lucy's tearful apologies for the barnyard chaos, he began to notice things about his new charges that the auction's focus on age and work capacity had obscured. Marcus Williams didn't just possess the physical strength of a 15-year-old. He had the organizational instincts of someone who'd been responsible for coordinating group activities. When the chicken-catching expedition threatened to become completely unmanageable, Marcus quietly divided the children into teams with specific assignments that turned chaotic running into systematic herding. Sarah Williams revealed herself as more than just a protective older sister. She'd somehow located Ezra's sewing kit and was repairing Emma's dress with stitches so neat they were nearly invisible, while simultaneously keeping track of everyone's whereabouts and managing to prevent Lucy from stepping on the very chickens they were trying to catch. Her competence extended beyond domestic skills. She'd identified potential safety hazards around the property and was already developing strategies for making the ranch more suitable for children. The Cooper twins, despite their obvious mischief-making potential, demonstrated the kind of wordless cooperation that made them remarkably efficient when properly directed. Daniel's boldness balanced David's caution, creating a partnership that could accomplish tasks neither could handle alone. When Marcus assigned them to repair the chicken coop's broken latch, they approached the problem with complementary skills. That produced surprisingly professional results. Even the youngest children possessed capabilities that the auction's emphasis on immediate work value had missed entirely. Emma Patterson's tears over her torn dress weren't just distress about damaged clothing. They reflected standards of personal appearance and self-respect that suggested careful upbringing despite her family's humble circumstances. Lucy Hayes, despite being only 6 years old, had an intuitive understanding of animal behavior that made her remarkably effective at calming frightened chickens once she overcame her initial fear of them. But it was the discovery of James Murphy's mechanical aptitude that forced Ezra to completely reconsider his assumptions about what 7 orphaned children might be capable of accomplishing. The boy's assessment of the fence problem was not only accurate, but accompanied by practical suggestions for solutions that revealed genuine understanding of construction principles. When Ezra tested him with questions about other maintenance issues around the ranch, James consistently identified problems and proposed repairs with the confidence of someone who'd learned by watching adults who knew their trade. By mid-morning, what had started as disaster management had evolved into something resembling productive cooperation. The chickens were secured in a properly repaired coop. Emma's dress was mended and actually looked better than it had before the tear, and the children had organized themselves into work teams that were tackling ranch maintenance projects with enthusiasm that bordered on eagerness. The transformation was so dramatic that Ezra found himself questioning whether he was witnessing normal childhood adaptability or something more significant. These children had lost everything: parents, home security, familiar surroundings, yet within hours of arriving at an isolated ranch owned by a stranger, they were not only adapting, but actively contributing to improving their new environment. The answer to his unspoken question came during lunch, when Sarah Williams presented him with a list she'd been compiling throughout the morning. Written in careful script that demonstrated formal education despite her family's apparent poverty, the list identified immediate needs, potential improvements, and resource requirements with the thoroughness of a business plan. "We talked about it while we were working," Sarah explained, her 13-year-old seriousness making her seem older than many adults Ezra had known. "There's a lot that needs doing around here, but most of it's the kind of work that goes faster with more people helping. We figure if we're going to be staying, we ought to make things better for everyone." The list was remarkable not just for its comprehensiveness, but for its understanding of priorities that reflected genuine insight into frontier life. Sarah had identified the fence repair as the most urgent task, correctly recognizing that containing livestock was essential for the ranch's economic survival. She'd noted that the garden needed expansion and winter preparation, that the barn required structural improvements before heavy snow arrived, and that the cabin would need modifications to house 8 people comfortably. But the list went beyond immediate practical concerns to address longer-term opportunities that Ezra had never considered. Sarah had observed that the ranch's location near the mountain trail used by freight wagons traveling between Denver and the mining camps created possibilities for additional income through services the property could provide. Travelers needed places to rest and resupply, their animals needed feed and water, and isolated ranches that could offer hospitality were often able to supplement their agricultural income significantly. More ambitiously, the list suggested that the ranch's combination of good water, adequate grazing, and proximity to both mining camps and established settlements made it potentially suitable for operations beyond simple farming. Sarah had noticed wild horses in the distant meadows and suggested that capturing and training them might prove more profitable than raising cattle. She'd identified stands of timber that could be harvested for sale to mining operations that required lumber for their underground workings. Most remarkably, the list concluded with educational goals that revealed how seriously these children took their own development despite the circumstances that had made them orphans. Sarah proposed establishing a regular schedule for lessons that would allow them to continue their schooling while contributing to the ranch's work. She'd identified books in Ezra's cabin that could serve as textbooks, and suggested ways to acquire additional educational materials through trade with traveling merchants. Reading the list, Ezra realized he was confronting a fundamental revision of everything he'd assumed about his situation. He'd thought he was rescuing 7 helpless children who would require care and support he could barely provide. Instead, he appeared to have acquired 7 partners who brought skills, energy, and perspectives that could transform his struggling homestead into something far more ambitious and successful than anything he'd imagined possible as a solitary bachelor farmer. The afternoon brought practical demonstrations of what such partnership might accomplish. Working together, the 8-person household completed more maintenance and improvement projects than Ezra typically managed in a month of individual effort. The fence repair that he'd been postponing indefinitely was finished before sunset, with James Murphy's technical insights proving as valuable as Marcus Williams's physical strength. Sarah's organizational abilities kept multiple projects progressing simultaneously without conflicts over tools or materials. But perhaps most importantly, the work was accomplished with a sense of shared purpose that transformed tedious tasks into collaborative achievements. The Cooper twins turned post-hole, digging into a competitive game that doubled their productivity while keeping them entertained. Emma Patterson's attention to detail made her invaluable for tasks requiring precision, like measuring fence wire and organizing hardware. Even Lucy Hayes contributed by fetching tools and serving as an early warning system for hazards the older children might miss in their focus on complex tasks. As evening approached and the group gathered around a dinner table that had never before accommodated 8 people, Ezra found himself contemplating possibilities that would have seemed like fantasies just 24 hours earlier. The children's enthusiasm for improving their new home suggested they were thinking in terms of permanent residence rather than temporary arrangement. Their willingness to tackle challenging projects indicated they were prepared to invest serious effort in building something substantial rather than simply surviving until circumstances changed. Most significantly, their ability to work together as a coordinated team revealed potential for accomplishing goals that would be impossible for individuals working alone. Sarah's planning abilities, Marcus's leadership skills, James's technical knowledge, the twins' energetic cooperation, and the younger children's detailed attention created a combination of capabilities that could address problems Ezra had considered beyond his resources. The poor rancher who'd spent his last money to keep 7 orphans together was beginning to understand that his impulsive act of compassion might have accidentally created something extraordinary. A family whose combined strengths could build achievements worthy of historical remembrance. But first, they would have to survive the coming winter with resources stretched far beyond their intended limits and challenges that would test every assumption about what was possible when desperate people refused to accept failure as inevitable. Transformation had begun, but the real test lay ahead in the months when good intentions would be measured against harsh realities and survival would depend on turning potential into performance. What they built next would either prove that compassion could triumph over practical limitations, or demonstrate that some gamblers, no matter how well-intentioned, were simply too ambitious for the resources available to support them. The first snowfall arrived 3 weeks earlier than anyone in Willow Creek could remember, transforming the Colorado landscape into a frozen wilderness that would test every preparation the Thompson household had made. What began as gentle flakes dancing in the October air quickly intensified into a blizzard that buried the ranch under 18 inches of snow and brought temperatures that froze water buckets solid within hours of being filled. Ezra woke before dawn to the sound of wind howling around the cabin with a ferocity that made the wooden walls creak and groan like a ship in a storm. The small pot-bellied stove that had adequately heated his bachelor quarters now struggled to warm the enlarged living space, and he could see his breath in the gray light filtering through frost-covered windows. Outside, the early winter storm was creating conditions that could prove deadly for anyone unprepared for its intensity. But the real crisis wasn't the weather itself, it was the stark arithmetic of survival that the blizzard had suddenly made urgent. 8 people required significantly more food, fuel, and shelter than Ezra had calculated when summer's abundance made winter seem distant and manageable. The vegetables stored in his root cellar, which had seemed adequate for one person through the cold months, would last perhaps 6 weeks, feeding a household of 8. The firewood he'd cut and stacked during autumn, following the same conservative estimates that had served his solitary existence, might provide heat for half the winter if used sparingly. Most critically, the livestock required shelter, feed, and daily care that became exponentially more difficult in deep snow and sub-zero temperatures. The 3 cows and handful of chickens that represented the ranch's primary assets for generating income and food could easily die if their needs weren't met consistently throughout the harsh mountain winter. Yet caring for animals in blizzard conditions with 7 children to protect presented logistics challenges that could overwhelm even experienced frontier families. As Ezra contemplated these sobering realities while stoking the fire to chase away the morning chill, he heard quiet voices coming from the main room where the children slept in makeshift beds arranged around the stove. Rather than the complaints or fears he might have expected from youngsters facing their first crisis in an unfamiliar home, the conversation carried the focused intensity of people solving problems together. Sarah Williams had assumed the role of morning coordinator, organizing the other children for tasks that would address immediate survival needs while Ezra dealt with the livestock. Her whispered instructions revealed planning that had obviously been conducted the previous evening, after the adults thought everyone was asleep. Marcus would help Ezra with the outdoor work that required physical strength and stamina. The Cooper twins would take responsibility for maintaining the fire and managing the limited supply of split wood. Emma would handle indoor tasks like cooking and cleaning that kept her near the warmth while contributing essential services. James had been assigned to monitor the cabin's structural integrity, checking for air leaks and moisture problems that could become dangerous in extreme cold. Even little Lucy had specific duties involving the care of household items and the organization of their limited supplies. The efficiency of their self-organization impressed Ezra almost as much as their initiative in creating it. These children had recognized the gravity of their situation without panic or despair, then developed practical responses that maximized their collective capabilities while acknowledging individual limitations. Rather than becoming burdens who required constant supervision and protection, they were transforming themselves into a coordinated team, capable of sharing survival responsibilities. The first test of their planning came when Ezra and Marcus ventured outside to care for the livestock trapped in the barn by snowdrifts that had piled against the doors overnight. The wind-driven snow stunned their faces like needles, and the temperature was cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Working together, they managed to clear enough snow to access the barn, but the effort required nearly 2 hours and left both of them exhausted before the day's real work had even begun. Inside the barn, they discovered problems that threatened the entire foundation of the ranch's economic survival. The sudden temperature drop had frozen the animals' water supply, requiring them to melt snow for drinking water while maintaining enough heat to prevent it from refreezing. The hay supply that had seemed adequate for winter feeding was being consumed faster than expected, because the animals needed extra nutrition to maintain body heat in the extreme cold. Most seriously, one of the cows was showing signs of illness that could spread to the other animals if not addressed quickly. Marcus proved invaluable during the crisis, demonstrating not just physical capability, but genuine understanding of animal husbandry that suggested experience beyond his 15 years. He'd correctly diagnosed the cow's condition as early pneumonia brought on by the sudden weather change, and his suggested treatment using warm mash and sheltered warmth showed practical knowledge that complemented Ezra's more theoretical education. Working together, they managed to stabilize the sick animal while implementing preventive measures for the rest of the herd. But the barn work revealed a larger problem that threatened to overwhelm their resources before spring arrived. Caring for livestock in such extreme conditions required constant attention, large quantities of feed and fuel, and labor that kept adults occupied for most of each day. With only Ezra and Marcus capable of the heavy outdoor work, and Marcus needed for numerous other tasks, the ranch's operations were stretched beyond sustainable limits. The solution emerged from an unexpected source when they returned to the cabin for the midday meal that Sarah had somehow managed to prepare despite working with limited ingredients and a temperamental stove. James Murphy had spent the morning examining the cabin's construction with the methodical attention of an engineer inspecting a bridge, and his findings had prompted him to develop proposals that could address several of their most pressing problems. Simultaneously, the 7-year-old had noticed that heat was escaping through gaps between logs that became more pronounced as the wood contracted in extreme cold. More importantly, he'd identified space under the cabin that could be enclosed and insulated to create additional storage for food and supplies. Most remarkably, he'd figured out how to modify the barn's design to improve heat retention while creating work areas that would allow livestock care to be accomplished more efficiently even in severe weather. James's proposals weren't just theoretical suggestions from a child playing with ideas. They were detailed plans that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of construction principles and practical engineering. He'd calculated material requirements, identified tools and techniques needed for implementation, and estimated labor time with accuracy that suggested genuine competence rather than lucky guessing. The plan's most ambitious element involved expanding the barn to include a workshop area where tools and equipment could be maintained and repaired throughout the winter. James had observed that isolated ranches often failed not because of single, catastrophic events, but because of accumulated small problems that couldn't be fixed promptly due to lack of proper facilities. A heated workshop would allow them to maintain their equipment, construct needed items from available materials, and potentially generate income by providing services to neighboring ranches facing similar challenges. Sarah had been developing complementary ideas focused on maximizing their food resources through preservation techniques and efficient utilization of everything the ranch could produce. She'd identified wild plants in the area that remained nutritious even after freezing, calculated optimal ratios for extending their stored vegetables with forage supplements, and proposed hunting strategies that could provide fresh meat while conserving their limited ammunition. More innovatively, Sarah had recognized that their household's unusual composition created opportunities for generating income during the winter months when most frontier families simply endured until spring. Her education and teaching experience could provide tutoring services for children in town whose families could afford such luxuries. Marcus's strength and reliability made him valuable for seasonal work, helping other ranches with livestock care during the most demanding winter tasks. Even the younger children possessed skills that could be marketed to families struggling with their own survival challenges. The Cooper twins had been developing their own contribution to the household's winter strategy, using their natural coordination to become remarkably efficient at tasks requiring 2 people working in perfect synchronization. They'd figured out how to operate a 2-person crosscut saw with professional skill, allowing them to process firewood faster than adults working individually. Their teamwork also proved invaluable for tasks like moving heavy objects, constructing improvements to the cabin, and managing multiple projects simultaneously. As the blizzard continued through its second day, the Thompson household's response to the crisis began to demonstrate capabilities that exceeded anything Ezra had imagined possible when he'd impulsively bid for 7 orphans at auction. Rather than simply enduring hardship until conditions improved, they were actively adapting their operations to take advantage of opportunities that winter presented while mitigating the threats it posed. The transformation was most evident in how they approached problems that would have overwhelmed a single person or even a conventional family. When the cabin's chimney began drawing poorly due to wind patterns created by the storm, James diagnosed the issue and designed a solution that Marcus and the twins could implement using materials salvaged from around the ranch. When their food supplies required careful rationing to last through an extended winter, Sarah developed meal plans that maintained nutrition while making every ingredient serve multiple purposes. But perhaps most remarkably, the children had begun to see their situation not as a series of problems to be survived, but as an opportunity to build something better than any of them could have achieved individually. Their discussions around the dinner table revealed plans that extended far beyond immediate survival to encompass improvements that could make the ranch more prosperous and self-sufficient than it had ever been under Ezra's solitary management. By the time the blizzard finally exhausted itself after 4 days of continuous snowfall, the Thompson household had not only survived their first major crisis but had used it as a catalyst for innovations that addressed fundamental weaknesses in the ranch's operations. They'd insulated the cabin, improved the barn, organized their resources for maximum efficiency, and established work patterns that distributed responsibilities according to individual strengths, while ensuring that essential tasks were completed regardless of weather conditions. More importantly, they'd proven to themselves and to Ezra that their unconventional family possessed the resilience and creativity necessary to thrive under frontier conditions that defeated many conventional households. The winter crisis that could have destroyed them had instead revealed capabilities that would allow them to build something extraordinary from the most humble beginnings. As they cleared paths through the snow and resumed normal operations under brilliant sunshine that made the frozen landscape sparkle like diamond dust, Ezra realized that the 7 orphans he'd bought at auction had already begun to transform his failing homestead into something that resembled a successful enterprise. But their real test lay ahead in the months when they would need to prove that crisis-driven innovation could be sustained through the routine challenges of frontier life. The poor rancher and his unlikely family had survived their first winter trial, but what they would build next would determine whether their early success represented temporary adaptation or the foundation for achievements that would indeed make history in the American West. Spring arrived in the Colorado Territory with the kind of explosive renewal that made winter's hardships seem like distant memories. But for the Thompson household, the seasonal change brought revelations that would transform their modest ranch into something far more significant than anyone could have anticipated. The discovery began innocently enough when Emma Patterson, now 10 years old and possessed of an insatiable curiosity about the natural world, stumbled upon something unusual while collecting wildflowers in the meadow behind their expanded barn. She'd been picking mountain lupines and Indian paintbrush for the dinner table centerpiece that had become one of her regular contributions to the household's daily routines, when her attention was caught by an odd glint of light reflecting from a rocky outcropping near the stream that provided their water supply. The reflection was too consistent and too bright to be ordinary stone, and Emma's careful upbringing had taught her to investigate unusual phenomena rather than dismiss them as unimportant. What she found embedded in the quartz-veined granite was a deposit of silver ore so rich and extensive that it would have made experienced prospectors wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. The vein ran along the creek bed for nearly a quarter mile, with surface deposits that suggested the underground formation continued far deeper than any amateur mining operation could explore. But Emma Patterson wasn't thinking about wealth when she carried samples back to the ranch house. She was excited about the pretty stones she'd discovered, and eager to share her find with the family that had become the center of her world. Ezra's reaction to Emma's discovery was a mixture of excitement and apprehension that reflected his growing understanding of how dramatically circumstances could change when valuable resources were involved. He'd heard enough stories about mining claims and boomtowns to know that silver deposits attracted attention from people, whose interests rarely aligned with those of existing landowners. The territorial government's laws regarding mineral rights were complex and often favored large mining companies over individual homesteaders, and the discovery of valuable ore on his property could easily result in legal challenges that would destroy everything they'd built together. But James Murphy, now 8 years old and already recognized within the family as their resident expert on practical engineering problems, approached the discovery with characteristically methodical analysis. He'd been studying the rock samples with intense concentration, using a magnifying glass from Ezra's limited collection of scientific instruments to examine the ore's structure and composition. His conclusions, delivered with the matter-of-fact precision that had become his trademark, revealed understanding that went far beyond his chronological age. "This isn't just silver," James announced during the family meeting they'd convened to discuss Emma's discovery. "There's copper mixed in, and what looks like traces of gold in the quartz matrix. The formation extends underground in at least 3 directions from the surface deposits, which means we're looking at a major mineral complex rather than an isolated pocket." The technical accuracy of James's assessment was confirmed when Marcus Williams returned from a scouting expedition to examine the full extent of the deposit. The 15-year-old had developed impressive skills as an outdoorsman during their months of ranch work, and his exploration of the surrounding terrain had revealed additional outcroppings that suggested the mineral formation covered a significant portion of their property. More importantly, Marcus had noticed that the geography of their land provided natural advantages for mining operations that could be developed without the massive capital investments typically required for such enterprises. The stream provided water for processing ore, the terrain allowed for relatively easy construction of access roads, and the location was close enough to establish transportation routes to make shipping economically viable, while remaining remote enough to avoid immediate attention from competing interests. Sarah Williams, now 14 and increasingly sophisticated in her understanding of economic and legal issues, had been researching territorial mining laws using books borrowed from the town's small library. Her findings revealed both opportunities and dangers that would require careful navigation if they hoped to benefit from Emma's discovery without losing everything they'd already accomplished. The territorial government granted mineral rights to property owners who could demonstrate legitimate claims and comply with established filing procedures, but the process was complex and expensive. More problematically, successful mining operations attracted investors, competitors, and speculators, who often used legal maneuvers or outright fraud to separate original discoverers from their claims. Small operators who lacked the resources to defend their interests frequently found themselves displaced by larger companies with better legal representation and deeper financial reserves. But Sarah had also identified provisions in territorial law that could protect their interests if they approached the development strategically. Homesteaders who could prove continuous residence and agricultural improvement were granted stronger protections than absentee claimants or purely speculative interests. More importantly, mining claims that were actively worked by their original owners enjoyed legal precedence over claims filed by outside parties attempting to dispute ownership. The family's discussion of these complex issues revealed how much their individual capabilities had grown during the months they'd been working together as a coordinated household. Rather than simply being excited about potential wealth or paralyzed by the legal complications involved, they were analyzing the situation with sophisticated understanding of both opportunities and risks. Their approach to the mineral discovery reflected the same methodical problem-solving that had enabled them to survive the winter crisis and improve their ranch operations beyond recognition. The Cooper twins, now 12 years old and known throughout the region for their uncanny ability to work together on complex tasks, had been developing ideas for how mining operations could be integrated with their existing agricultural activities. Daniel's natural optimism balanced David's cautious analysis, creating a partnership that could envision ambitious possibilities while identifying practical limitations that needed to be addressed. Their proposal involved developing the mine gradually, using profits from initial small-scale operations to fund expansion while maintaining the ranch activities that provided their basic subsistence. Rather than abandoning farming in favor of mining, they could create a diversified operation that wouldn't be completely dependent on mineral prices or the eventual exhaustion of ore deposits. The twins had also recognized that their families' unusual composition provided advantages for mining development that conventional operations typically lacked. Their combination of technical knowledge, physical capabilities, and organizational skills meant they could handle many aspects of mining without hiring expensive outside labor. James's engineering abilities could solve construction and equipment problems. Marcus's strength and leadership could manage the physical work, and Sarah's planning capabilities could coordinate complex operations involving multiple simultaneous activities. Even little Lucy Hayes, now 7 years old and remarkably mature for her age, had developed insights that proved valuable for understanding the practical implications of their discovery. Her natural empathy and attention to human dynamics had led her to recognize that mining operations would inevitably attract attention from outside their immediate community, bringing both opportunities and challenges that would require careful management. Lucy had observed that their success as a family had been built on cooperation and mutual support that might be threatened by the kivung, wealth and external pressures that mining could introduce. She'd also noticed that their neighbors' attitudes toward them had already begun changing as word spread about their ranch's remarkable transformation from struggling homestead to prosperous enterprise. The addition of mining wealth could accelerate these changes in ways that might undermine the relationships they'd built within the local community. Her concerns proved prophetic when a delegation of businessmen from Denver arrived at the ranch less than 2 weeks after Emma's discovery became known in Willow Creek. The visitors, led by a mining engineer named Harrison Blackwood, who represented Eastern investment interests, had come to make an offer for the mineral rights that they clearly expected would be irresistible to a poor rancher and 7 orphan children. Blackwood's proposal was structured to appear generous while actually transferring most of the potential profits to his investors. He offered to purchase the mining rights for $5,000 cash, plus a small percentage of future profits in exchange for assuming all the risks and expenses of development. For people who'd been struggling to survive on marginal ranch income, $5,000 represented a fortune that could transform their lives immediately rather than requiring years of uncertain mining operations. But the family's response to Blackwood's offer demonstrated how much their understanding of business and legal matters had evolved since their early days together. Rather than being overwhelmed by the apparent generosity of the proposal, they requested time to study the contract terms and consult with independent advisors about the long-term implications of surrendering their mineral rights. Sarah's analysis of the contract revealed provisions that would have transferred not just the immediate mining rights but also significant control over their property's future development. Blackwood's company would gain the authority to construct roads, divert water sources, and establish facilities that could interfere with their ranching operations even after the mining concluded. More problematically, the percentage of profits offered to the original landowners was calculated using formulas that heavily favored the mining company's accounting methods. James's technical review of Blackwood's development plans identified engineering approaches that prioritize speed and cost reduction over environmental protection or long-term sustainability. The proposed mining methods would have extracted the most accessible ore quickly, while making future development more difficult and expensive. The water management system showed little consideration for protecting the stream that provided their household and livestock with essential resources. Marcus's investigation of Blackwood's background revealed a pattern of mining ventures that had enriched investors while leaving original landowners with depleted property and legal disputes. Several of the engineers' previous projects had resulted in lawsuits from homesteaders, who discovered that their contracts contained provisions they hadn't understood when signing. The family's decision to decline Blackwood's offer, delivered politely but firmly during a second meeting, surprised the mining engineer and clearly frustrated his assumptions about dealing with unsophisticated frontier families. His response revealed the pressures they would face as word of their mineral discovery spread to wider circles of people interested in profiting from other people's resources. "You're making a serious mistake," Blackwood warned as he prepared to leave their property. "Mining is a complex business that requires technical expertise and substantial capital. Amateurs who try to develop claims without proper backing typically lose everything they invest and end up selling for much less than they could have received initially." But as Ezra watched the Denver businessman's carriage disappear down the trail toward town, he realized that the Thompson family was no longer the collection of desperate individuals who'd been brought together by an impulsive decision at an orphan auction. They'd become something unprecedented in the American West, a household that combined youth and experience, technical knowledge and practical wisdom, individual capabilities and collective strength in ways that made them remarkably effective at solving problems that defeated conventional approaches, the silver discovery that could have destroyed their unity by introducing outside pressures and conflicting interests had instead revealed how completely they'd learned to function as a coordinated team. Their decision to develop the mine themselves, using methods that protected their long-term interests while building on the skills they'd already developed, represented a commitment to principles that valued sustainability over quick profits and family loyalty over individual advancement. What they would build next would test every assumption about what was possible when ordinary people refused to accept limitations that others considered insurmountable. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction was about to discover that sometimes the greatest treasures are found not in the ground but in the courage to pursue extraordinary goals with the people who matter most. The sound of hammers and pickaxes echoed across the Colorado Valley as the Thompson family embarked on the most ambitious construction project anyone in the territory had ever attempted without outside capital or professional mining expertise. 6 months after rejecting Harrison Blackwood's offer, they had transformed their modest ranch into the hub of an integrated operation that defied every conventional assumption about how mining enterprises should be developed and managed. Transformation had begun with James Murphy's revolutionary approach to mine engineering, which prioritized sustainability and worker safety over the speed and cost-cutting that characterized most frontier mining operations. Now 9 years old, but possessed of technical knowledge that impressed visiting geologists, James had designed a mining system that extracted ore efficiently while preserving the underground formations for long-term productivity. His innovations included ventilation systems that kept the air breathable at depth, support structures that prevented cave-ins, and water management that protected both the mine workings and the stream that remained essential for their agricultural operations. But the most remarkable aspect of James's engineering wasn't its technical sophistication. It was how perfectly the design integrated with the family's existing capabilities and their long-term vision for sustainable development. Rather than requiring expensive specialized equipment that would have forced them into debt or partnership with outside investors, the mining system used tools and techniques that could be manufactured or adapted from materials available locally. The result was an operation that remained completely under their control while producing ore quality and quantity that rivaled much larger commercial mines. Sarah Williams, now 15 and recognized throughout the region as a formidable businesswoman, despite her youth, had developed the commercial strategies that turned their mining success into diversified prosperity. Her negotiations with ore buyers in Denver had secured contracts that paid premium prices for their silver, while establishing relationships that provided access to markets for their agricultural products as well. More importantly, she'd structured these agreements to maintain their independence rather than becoming dependent on single buyers who might later dictate unfavorable terms. Sarah's business acumen extended far beyond simple ore sales to encompass a vision of economic development that could benefit their entire community while strengthening their own position. She'd recognized that successful mining operations required numerous support services, equipment maintenance, food supply, construction materials that represented opportunities for local businesses willing to meet those needs reliably and efficiently. Working with merchants in Willow Creek and neighboring towns, Sarah had helped establish supply chains that brought mining-related business to the region while ensuring that the Thompson operation received priority access to essential goods and services. The result was a network of mutually beneficial relationships that made their enterprise more resilient while contributing to the economic growth of communities that had been struggling since the original silver boom ended. Marcus Williams had emerged as the operational leader whose physical capabilities and organizational skills made the ambitious plans developed by his younger siblings into practical realities. At 16, he possessed the strength and endurance to handle the most demanding mining work while maintaining the leadership qualities necessary to coordinate complex projects involving multiple simultaneous activities. His ability to work productively with people of all ages had made him invaluable for managing relationships with the growing number of neighbors and business partners who were becoming involved with their expanding operations. But Marcus's most important contribution was his understanding of how to maintain the family unity that remained the foundation of everything they'd accomplished together. As their enterprise grew and attracted attention from throughout the territory, they faced increasing pressures to formalize their organization in ways that might have disrupted the cooperative relationships that made their success possible. Marcus's leadership helped them navigate these challenges while preserving the mutual trust and shared commitment that distinguished their operation from conventional business ventures. The Cooper twins had become the mechanical specialists whose innovative solutions kept their mining equipment operating efficiently despite the harsh conditions and heavy use that quickly destroyed conventional machinery. Daniel and David, now 13 years old, had developed modifications to standard mining tools that improved productivity while reducing the physical demands on workers. Their partnership remained as seamlessly coordinated as ever, but their technical abilities had evolved to the point where visiting engineers regularly sought their advice about equipment problems that had stumped more experienced professionals. More remarkably, the twins had begun inventing entirely new devices that addressed problems no one else had thought to solve. Their compressed air ventilation system drew fresh air into the mine workings more effectively than any existing technology, while their modified ore cars made transportation from underground more efficient than methods used by much larger operations. These innovations attracted attention from mining companies throughout the West, creating opportunities for licensing their designs that provided additional income while establishing their reputation as technical innovators. Emma Patterson, now 11 years old and known throughout the region for the discovery that had started their mining enterprise, had developed into the family's expert on geology and ore quality assessment. Her natural eye for identifying valuable minerals had been refined through intensive study of geological formations and mineral composition, making her ability to locate new deposits almost supernaturally accurate. But Emma's contributions extended beyond simply finding ore to understanding how different mineral formations could be developed most effectively for long-term productivity. Her explorations of their property had identified multiple additional ore bodies that could support mining operations for decades, while her analysis of ore quality helped optimize their extraction methods for maximum value. More importantly, Emma's geological knowledge had enabled them to understand the regional mineral formations well enough to acquire additional claims on neighboring properties that contained extensions of their original deposits. Little Lucy Hayes, now 8 years old, but possessed of remarkable maturity and insight, had become the family specialist in human relations and community development. Her natural empathy and attention to social dynamics made her invaluable for maintaining the positive relationships with neighbors and business partners that were essential for their continued success. Lucy's ability to understand different people's motivations and concerns had prevented numerous conflicts that could have undermined their enterprise, but Lucy's most important role was preserving the family culture that kept them united despite the wealth and external pressures that might have driven other groups apart. She'd organized regular family meetings where important decisions were discussed openly, established traditions that maintained their sense of shared identity, and created systems for ensuring that everyone's contributions were recognized and valued regardless of their age or the specific nature of their work. The integrated operation they'd built defied easy categorization because it combined elements that were typically kept separate in frontier economic development. Their mining activities provided the capital necessary for expanding their agricultural operations, while their farming supplied food for the growing workforce and community that had developed around their enterprise. Their technical innovations created income through licensing agreements with other mining companies, while their business relationships provided access to markets and resources that made further expansion possible. But perhaps most remarkably, they'd accomplished all this while maintaining the cooperative spirit and mutual support that had enabled them to survive their early challenges at unlikely family. Rather than allowing success to create hierarchies or competition among family members, they developed systems that utilized everyone's unique capabilities while ensuring that the benefits of their achievements were shared equitably. The physical transformation of their property reflected the scope of what they'd accomplished in less than 2 years. The original modest ranch buildings had been expanded and supplemented with mining facilities, workshops, storage buildings, and housing for the workers who'd been attracted to their operation. But rather than the chaotic sprawl that characterized many boom towns, their development had been planned carefully to integrate industrial and agricultural activities while maintaining the environmental quality that made the location attractive for long-term residents. Their mining works included not just the underground operations, but also processing facilities that refined ore on-site rather than shipping raw materials to distant smelters. This vertical integration increased their profits while providing employment for local workers who might otherwise have been forced to seek opportunities elsewhere. The processing facilities also served neighboring mines on a contract basis, creating additional income while establishing their operation as a regional center for mining-related services. The agricultural components of their enterprise had expanded far beyond their original subsistence farming to include commercial production of crops and livestock that supplied mining camps throughout the region. Their location at the intersection of mountain trails made them a natural stopping point for freight wagons and travelers, creating opportunities for hospitality services that generated income while providing information about regional economic conditions and opportunities. But the most innovative aspect of their development was the educational component that reflected Ezra's background as a teacher and the family's commitment to long-term community development. They'd established a school that served not just their own household, but also the children of workers and neighbors who'd previously had no access to formal education. The school's curriculum included practical subjects like engineering, geology, and business management alongside traditional academic topics, creating a generation of young people equipped to contribute to the region's continued development. The school had also become a center for adult education, offering evening classes in technical subjects that helped local workers develop skills that made them more valuable and better paid. These educational activities created loyalty and stability in their workforce while contributing to the overall economic development of the region in ways that would continue long after their mining operations eventually concluded. By the autumn of 1869, less than 2 years after Emma's discovery of silver ore, the Thompson family had created an enterprise that employed over 60 people, generated income from multiple sources, and served as a model for sustainable development that attracted visitors from throughout the American West. Government officials, business leaders, and journalists came to study their methods and understand how such remarkable success had been achieved by people who'd started with almost nothing except determination and mutual support. But their greatest achievement wasn't measured in dollars earned or ore extracted. It was the demonstration that alternative approaches to frontier development could create prosperity while preserving the human values and environmental quality that made success meaningful. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction had accidentally created something unprecedented, a family business that proved cooperation could triumph over competition, that innovation could emerge from the most unlikely sources, and that sustainable practices could be more profitable than short-term exploitation. What they would build next would test whether their success could be sustained, as it attracted attention from forces that viewed their prosperity as an opportunity to be exploited rather than an example to be emulated. The telegram arrived on a crisp November morning in 1869, delivered by a writer whose urgent pace and grim expression suggested that the news he carried would change everything the Thompson family had worked to build. The message, sent from the territorial capital in Denver, was brief but devastating. Federal mining commissioners arriving December 1st to investigate irregularities in Thompson claims. Legal challenge filed by Consolidated Western Mining. Recommend immediate legal counsel. Attorney General's Office. Ezra read the telegram 3 times before its implications fully registered, his hands trembling not from the cold mountain air but from recognition that their worst fears about the vulnerability of their success were about to be tested in ways that could destroy everything they'd accomplished. The legal challenge they'd always known was possible had finally materialized, backed by resources and influence that made Harrison Blackwood's earlier offer seem like a friendly negotiation compared to the coordinated assault they now faced. Consolidated Western Mining Corporation represented exactly the kind of large-scale operation that had been systematically displacing small miners throughout the American West. Based in San Francisco with financial backing from Eastern investors, the company specialized in acquiring valuable mining properties through legal maneuvers that challenged the claims of original discoverers, who lacked the resources to defend themselves effectively. Their standard approach involved identifying successful small operations, filing competing claims based on technical disputes about surveying or filing procedures, then using superior legal resources to force settlements that transferred ownership to their corporate interests. The specific nature of their challenge to the Thompson claims had been carefully calculated to exploit weaknesses in territorial law that favored large companies over individual homesteaders. Consolidated Western's attorneys argued that Emma's original discovery had occurred on land that wasn't properly included in Ezra's homestead filing, making their mining rights invalid under federal regulations governing mineral extraction on public lands. They'd also claimed that the family's failure to follow specific notification procedures required for commercial mining operations had forfeited their legal protections under territorial statutes. But the most insidious aspect of their legal strategy was the allegation that the Thompson operation represented unfair competition because it utilized child labor in violation of territorial regulations governing working conditions in dangerous industries. By characterizing the family's cooperative approach as exploitation of miners, Consolidated Western hoped to generate public sympathy for their takeover while painting the Thompsons as unscrupulous operators who prioritized profits over child welfare. Sarah Williams understood immediately that they were facing an existential threat that required Responses far more sophisticated than anything they'd needed to develop during their rise to prosperity. At 16, she'd become one of the most respected business leaders in Colorado Territory, but her youth and gender would be used against her in legal proceedings designed to favor established corporate interests over innovative approaches to frontier development. The family's emergency council meeting that evening revealed how much their individual capabilities had grown, but also exposed the limitations they faced when confronting opponents with vastly superior financial resources and political connections. Marcus's operational leadership, James's technical innovations, and the twins' mechanical expertise were all valuable assets, but none of them directly addressed the legal and political challenges that threatened to invalidate everything they'd built together. "They're not just trying to steal our mine," Sarah explained as she outlined the scope of Consolidated Western's challenge. "They're attacking the legal foundation of our entire operation. If they succeed in proving that our original claims were invalid, we could lose not just the mining rights but potentially the ranch itself, since we've used mining profits to purchase additional land and make improvements that might be considered part of the disputed property." The implications were staggering for a family that had invested 3 years of their lives in building something they believed was legally secure. Every innovation they'd developed, every relationship they'd cultivated, every improvement they'd made to their property could be lost if Consolidated Western succeeded in their legal challenge. More personally devastating, the family that had been forged through shared hardship and mutual support could be scattered if they lost the enterprise that had enabled them to remain together. James Murphy, now 10 years old, but recognized throughout the region for his engineering expertise, approached the crisis with characteristic analytical precision. His assessment of their technical documentation revealed potential vulnerabilities in how they'd recorded their mining activities and geological surveys. While their actual work had been conducted according to the highest professional standards, the informal nature of their record keeping reflected their origins as a family operation rather than a corporate enterprise. "We need to prove not just that our claims are legal, but that our methods are superior to anything Consolidated Western could accomplish," James concluded after reviewing the technical aspects of their situation. "If we can demonstrate that our approach produces better results while treating workers fairly and protecting the environment, it becomes harder for them to argue that the public interest would be served by transferring our operation to corporate control." The strategy that emerged from their discussions represented a radical departure from conventional approaches to legal challenges in the mining industry. Rather than simply defending their existing rights, they would demonstrate that their innovative methods represented a model for frontier development that deserved protection and support from territorial authorities concerned about long-term economic growth and social stability. Marcus Williams took responsibility for documenting their employment practices in ways that would refute allegations of child labor exploitation. His carefully maintained records showed that every member of their household received education appropriate to their age, that dangerous work was restricted to adults with proper training, and that their safety standards exceeded those of any comparable operation in the territory. More importantly, he could demonstrate that their approach had produced remarkably low accident rates and high worker satisfaction compared to conventional mining operations. The Cooper twins focused on preparing technical documentation that would establish their innovations as significant contributions to mining engineering rather than amateur improvisations. Daniel and David had maintained detailed drawings and specifications for all their mechanical improvements, creating a portfolio of intellectual property that demonstrated genuine technological advancement. Their inventions had been sought after by mining companies throughout the West, providing evidence that their family's operation represented progress rather than primitive exploitation of natural resources. Emma Patterson's geological surveys became crucial evidence for establishing the validity of their original discovery and the accuracy of their subsequent claim extensions. Her methodical documentation of ore formations and mineral quality provided scientific foundation for their mining activities that exceeded the standards typically maintained by much larger operations. More importantly, her work demonstrated that their development had been based on genuine expertise rather than luck or opportunistic exploitation of bureaucratic oversights. Lucy Hayes, despite being only 9 years old, contributed insights about community relations that proved essential for building political support against Consolidated Western's challenge. Her attention to social dynamics had enabled her to maintain detailed knowledge of how their operation was perceived by neighbors, workers, and local officials. This information became invaluable for identifying allies who could testify about the positive impact their enterprise had on regional development. But the family's most powerful weapon against Consolidated Western's challenge was the demonstration of what they'd actually accomplished in less than 3 years. Their integrated operation employed more workers at better wages than any comparable enterprise in the territory. Their educational initiatives had provided opportunities for dozens of children who'd previously had no access to schooling. Their technical innovations had improved mining safety and efficiency throughout the region. Their business practices had contributed to the economic development of multiple communities while maintaining environmental standards that preserved long-term productivity. The question was whether these achievements would be sufficient to overcome legal challenges backed by corporate resources that dwarfed anything a frontier family could afford to spend on attorneys and court proceedings. Consolidated Western had already demonstrated their willingness to use procedural technicalities and political influence to achieve objectives that couldn't be accomplished through fair competition. The family's response required mobilizing every relationship they'd built and every reputation they'd earned during their rise to prominence. Sarah began organizing support from business leaders throughout Colorado Territory who recognized that Consolidated Western's success would establish precedents, threatening to any innovative enterprise that achieved success without corporate backing. Marcus coordinated testimony from workers and community members who could speak directly about the positive impact of their operation. The twins prepared technical demonstrations that would showcase their innovations for government investigators who might not understand the significance of their achievements. But perhaps most importantly, they began documenting their story in ways that would preserve their legacy regardless of the legal proceedings' outcome. Ezra's background as a teacher had given him appreciation for the importance of historical records, and he began working with Sarah to create comprehensive documentation of how 7 orphan children and a struggling rancher had built something unprecedented in the American West. The stakes extended far beyond their personal fate to encompass fundamental questions about the kind of development that would characterize the American frontier. Would the West be developed by large corporations that prioritized profits over community welfare? Or could innovative approaches that balanced economic success with social responsibility establish alternative models for regional growth? Would technical innovation emerge from established institutions with adequate resources? Or could it arise from unexpected sources when creative individuals were given opportunities to pursue their ideas? The Thompson family's battle with Consolidated Western Mining Corporation would test whether the American legal system could protect genuine achievement against corporate predation, whether frontier communities would support innovative enterprises that contributed to their development, and whether a family forged through shared hardship could maintain their unity when facing pressures designed to destroy everything they'd built together. As December 1st approached and federal investigators prepared to examine their operation, the Thompsons understood that they were fighting not just for their own survival, but for principles that would determine the future character of the American West. Their success had already proven that extraordinary achievements were possible when desperation met opportunity and individual capabilities were combined through genuine cooperation. Now they would discover whether such achievements could be sustained when they attracted the attention of forces that viewed innovation as a threat to be eliminated rather than an example to be celebrated. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction was about to learn whether the empire they'd built together was strong enough to survive the greatest challenge they'd ever faced. The federal hearing convened in Denver's territorial courthouse on December 15, 1869, drawing the largest crowd of spectators in Colorado Territory's legal history. Representatives from mining companies throughout the West had traveled to witness proceedings that would establish precedents affecting property rights and corporate power across the entire frontier. Newspaper correspondents from as far away as New York and San Francisco filled the press gallery, recognizing that the Thompson family's battle with Consolidated Western Mining Corporation represented conflicts that were reshaping the American economy. Federal Mining Commissioner William Bradford presided over the proceedings with the stern authority of someone who'd spent decades adjudicating disputes between competing interests in territories where legal frameworks were still evolving. His reputation for fairness was balanced by practical understanding that territorial development required stable legal foundations that encouraged investment while protecting legitimate property rights. The decisions made during these hearings would influence frontier development patterns for generations. Consolidated Western's legal team was led by attorney Harrison Blackwood, the same mining engineer who'd attempted to purchase the Thompson claims 2 years earlier, now representing corporate interests with resources sufficient to challenge any obstacle to their acquisition goals. His transformation from individual entrepreneur to corporate attorney illustrated the consolidation of Western mining under large-scale operations that could mobilize political and legal resources beyond the reach of individual miners. Blackwood's opening arguments followed the strategy the family had anticipated, challenging both the technical legality of their claims and the legitimacy of their mining methods. He presented surveying documents that allegedly showed discrepancies in the boundaries of Ezra's original homestead filing, argued that the family's failure to follow specific notification procedures had invalidated their mineral rights, and characterized their employment of children as violation of territorial labor regulations that required government intervention. But Blackwood's most sophisticated attack focused on broader policy arguments about efficient resource development that resonated with territorial officials concerned about attracting the investment capital necessary for large-scale economic growth. He argued that individual mining operations, regardless of their temporary success, lacked the financial resources and technical expertise necessary for maximizing the economic benefits of valuable mineral deposits. Corporate development, he claimed, would generate more employment, higher tax revenues, and faster regional growth than could be achieved by family enterprises operating on limited scales. The Thompson family's defense was coordinated by attorney Margaret Sinclair, a Denver lawyer whose reputation for representing individual clients against corporate interests had made her the obvious choice despite the financial strain her fees imposed on their resources. Sinclair's strategy was built around demonstrating that the family's achievements represented exactly the kind of innovative development that territorial policy should encourage rather than eliminate through legal technicalities. Sarah Williams served as the primary witness for their defense, presenting documentation that methodically refuted every aspect of Consolidated Western's challenge. Her testimony revealed sophisticated understanding of territorial law, mining regulations, and business practices that impressed even skeptical observers who'd expected to encounter unsophisticated frontier settlers overwhelmed by legal complexities beyond their comprehension. Commissioner Bradford, Sarah said during her opening testimony, "We're not here to defend against technical violations of bureaucratic procedures. We're here to demonstrate that our family's approach to mining development has produced results that exceed anything Consolidated Western could accomplish, while maintaining standards of worker treatment and environmental protection that should serve as models for the entire industry." Her presentation included financial records showing that their operation generated higher profits per ton of ore extracted than comparable corporate mines, employed more workers per dollar of investment, and maintained safety standards that had resulted in 0 serious accidents during 3 years of operation. More importantly, she documented their contributions to regional development through education, infrastructure, and business relationships that had strengthened entire communities rather than simply extracting wealth for distant investors. James Murphy's technical testimony provided scientific foundation for their defense that challenged Consolidated Western's claims about superior corporate expertise. Now 11 years old, but commanding respect from professional engineers throughout the territory, James presented detailed analysis of their mining methods, mechanical innovations, and geological assessments that demonstrated technical competence exceeding industry standards. His presentation included working models of the ventilation systems, or processing equipment, and safety devices he designed for their operation. These innovations had been adopted by mining companies throughout the West, generating licensing revenue that proved their value while establishing the Thompson operation as a source of technological advancement rather than primitive resource extraction. The mining methods we've developed produce higher ore recovery rates with lower environmental impact than anything currently used by large-scale operations, James explained while demonstrating his compressed air ventilation system. Corporate mining companies have actually hired us to solve technical problems their own engineers couldn't address. How can they argue that our operation should be transferred to less competent management? Marcus Williams testified about their employment practices, presenting records that documented working conditions, wages, and safety procedures that contradicted Consolidated Western's allegations of child labor exploitation. His testimony was supported by dozens of current and former workers who'd traveled to Denver to defend an operation that had provided them with better treatment and higher pay than they'd experienced at corporate-owned mines. Every person working in our operation is there by choice, Marcus explained. We pay wages above industry standards, provide training that makes workers more valuable throughout their careers, and maintain safety standards that have resulted in the lowest accident rates in Colorado Territory. Anyone who wants to characterize our employment practices as exploitation hasn't visited our operation or talked to our workers. The Cooper twins provided demonstrations of their mechanical innovations that showcased technical achievements corporate critics claimed were impossible without large research and development budgets. Daniel and David presented working models of equipment improvements that had increased productivity while reducing physical demands on workers, creating solutions that established mining companies had been unable to develop despite their superior resources. Their testimony was particularly effective because it demonstrated that significant innovations could emerge from unexpected sources when creative individuals were given opportunities to pursue their ideas. The twins' inventions had been sought after by mining companies throughout the West, providing evidence that small operations could contribute to technological advancement rather than simply benefiting from corporate research. Emma Patterson's geological testimony established the scientific foundation for their mining activities while demonstrating that their resource development was based on expertise rather than luck or opportunistic exploitation of bureaucratic oversights. Her detailed surveys and mineral analyses provided evidence that their operation had been conducted according to professional standards that exceeded requirements for much larger enterprises. But perhaps most importantly, Emma's testimony revealed that their geological knowledge had enabled them to develop their mineral resources more efficiently than conventional approaches that prioritize speed over long-term productivity. Her methodical analysis had identified ore formations that would support decades of sustainable extraction, while corporate development typically exhausted accessible deposits quickly without regard for long-term resource management. Lucy Hayes, despite being only 10 years old, provided testimony about community impact that demonstrated the broader benefits of their approach to frontier development. Her presentation included letters from teachers, business owners, and local officials throughout the region who credited the Thompson operation with contributing to economic growth and social development that strengthened entire communities. "We're not just running a mining operation," Lucy explained with remarkable poise for someone her age. "We're building communities that will continue growing long after the mines are exhausted. Corporate operations extract wealth and leave behind environmental damage and abandoned towns. Our approach creates lasting benefits for everyone." The hearing's most dramatic moment came when Commissioner Bradford announced that federal investigators had completed independent evaluations of both the Thompson operation and comparable corporate-owned mines throughout the territory. Their findings supported every claim made by the family's defense, while raising serious questions about Consolidated Western's business practices and environmental standards. The investigators' report documented that the Thompson operation achieved higher productivity, better safety records, superior environmental protection, and greater community benefit than any corporate-owned mine in Colorado Territory. More damaging to Consolidated Western's case, the investigation had uncovered evidence of questionable surveying practices and procedural violations in several of the company's previous acquisitions that raised doubts about their own legal compliance. Commissioner Bradford's decision, delivered after 3 days of testimony and deliberation, represented a landmark ruling that would influence frontier development policy throughout the American West. He not only rejected Consolidated Western's challenge to the Thompson claims, but established legal precedents that strengthened protection for innovative small operations against corporate predation. The evidence presented during these proceedings demonstrates that the Thompson family has achieved extraordinary success through methods that represent the best aspects of American frontier development. Bradford concluded, "Their operation serves as proof that individual enterprise, when supported by appropriate legal protections, can produce results that exceed anything achieved by large-scale corporate development." But Bradford's ruling went beyond simply protecting the Thompson family's specific interests to establish broader principles about the kind of development that territorial policy should encourage. He ruled that mining claims developed through innovative methods that produced superior results, while maintaining high standards of worker treatment and environmental protection, deserved enhanced legal protection against challenges based on technical procedures rather than substantial violations. More importantly, Bradford's decision established that allegations of child labor exploitation required evidence of actual harm rather than simply the presence of children in family enterprises where they received education and appropriate protection. His ruling recognized that frontier families necessarily involved children in productive activities while distinguishing between exploitation and legitimate family cooperation. The immediate celebration that followed Bradford's announcement reflected recognition that the Thompson family had achieved something unprecedented in American legal history. They'd successfully defended innovative approaches to frontier development against corporate interests backed by vastly superior resources, establishing precedents that would protect other small operations from similar predatory challenges. But their victory represented more than personal triumph. It demonstrated that the American legal system could protect genuine achievement against corporate manipulation when presented with clear evidence of superior performance and community benefit. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction had accidentally created a model for frontier development that proved individual enterprise could accomplish things that corporate resources couldn't duplicate. Their success in the Denver courthouse had established legal foundations that would enable them to continue building something truly extraordinary in the American West. But what they accomplished next would determine whether their innovative approach could be sustained and replicated by others who shared their vision of development that balanced economic success with community welfare and environmental responsibility. The victory in Denver had transformed the Thompson family from local success story into national symbol of American innovation and determination. But the attention their legal triumph attracted brought opportunities and responsibilities that would test their ability to maintain their values while expanding their influence far beyond the Colorado Territory. By the spring of 1870, delegations of business leaders, government officials, and social reformers were making pilgrimages to their ranch to study methods that had achieved what many considered impossible, creating prosperity while maintaining principles of cooperation, environmental stewardship, and community development. The first major test of their expanded influence came when the territorial governor, Samuel Crawford, requested their assistance in developing mining regulations that would encourage responsible development throughout Colorado. The existing legal framework had been designed primarily to facilitate rapid resource extraction by large corporations, with little consideration for long-term environmental impact or community welfare. Governor Crawford recognized that the Thompson family's demonstrated success provided a model for alternative approaches that could generate greater economic benefits while avoiding the boom and bust cycles that had characterized previous mining developments. Sarah Williams, now 17 and acknowledged as one of the most sophisticated business minds in the American West, took the lead in developing policy recommendations that would incorporate their innovations into territorial law. Her proposals focused on creating incentives for mining operations that maintained high safety standards, provided worker education and training, contributed to local community development, and implemented environmental protection measures that preserved long-term productivity. But Sarah's most revolutionary proposal involved establishing cooperative ownership structures that would allow workers and communities to share in the profits generated by local resource development, rather than limiting benefits to distant investors. Her plan would create mechanisms for ensuring that mining wealth contributed to regional prosperity in ways that continued long after ore deposits were exhausted. The policy development process required Sarah to work with attorneys, economists, and government officials whose understanding of mining was based on conventional corporate models that prioritized short-term profits over sustainable development. Her challenge was translating their family's practical experience into legal frameworks that could be implemented by operators who lacked their unique combination of technical expertise, cooperative spirit, and long-term vision. James Murphy's role in this expansion involved sharing their technical innovations through formal engineering education programs that would prepare a new generation of mining professionals to implement safer and more efficient methods. At 12 years old, he'd become the youngest person ever invited to address the Colorado School of Mines, where his lectures on ventilation systems, ore processing, and equipment design drew audiences that included some of the most experienced mining engineers in the American West. James's teaching responsibilities extended beyond simply explaining existing innovations to developing systematic approaches for training engineers who could adapt their methods to different geological conditions and operational requirements. His curriculum emphasized understanding underlying principles rather than memorizing specific techniques, enabling students to solve problems that hadn't been anticipated when their training began. But perhaps most importantly, James's educational work included training programs for workers who'd previously been excluded from technical education because of their backgrounds or economic circumstances. His evening classes and weekend workshops provided opportunities for practical miners to develop engineering knowledge that made them more valuable while improving safety and efficiency throughout the industry. Marcus Williams had emerged as the leader of a growing network of mining operations that were adopting their cooperative management approaches and innovative techniques. His responsibilities included consulting with family-owned mines throughout the West that wanted to implement similar methods, coordinating technical assistance programs that shared their innovations with smaller operators, and developing training systems that prepared managers for the unique challenges of running enterprises that balanced profitability with worker welfare and community development. Marcus's consulting work revealed that their success hadn't been achieved simply through superior techniques or fortunate circumstances, but through cultural approaches that treated workers as partners rather than employees and viewed long-term sustainability as more important than short-term profits. Replicating these approaches required fundamental changes in management, philosophy that many operators found difficult to implement despite recognizing their benefits. The most challenging aspect of Marcus's expanding responsibilities involved mediating disputes between operators who were attempting to adopt cooperative methods and established interests that viewed such approaches as threats to conventional business relationships. His diplomatic skills and demonstrated success made him valuable for resolving conflicts that might otherwise have prevented innovative methods from spreading throughout the industry. The Cooper twins had become the focal point for a technological revolution that was transforming mining equipment design throughout the American West. Daniel and David's inventions were being manufactured and distributed by companies in Denver, San Francisco, and Chicago, generating licensing revenue that supported their continued research, while making improved equipment available to operators who couldn't afford to develop their own innovations. But the twins' most significant contribution involved establishing research and development partnerships with engineering schools and equipment manufacturers that created systematic approaches to technological advancement rather than relying on individual inspiration. Their workshops and laboratories provided facilities where experienced miners could collaborate with trained engineers to solve practical problems that neither group could address independently. The twins had also begun developing training programs that taught maintenance and repair techniques to operators in remote locations who couldn't access professional engineering services when equipment failed. Their emphasis on designing equipment that could be serviced using locally available materials and skills made advanced technology practical for small operations that had previously been limited to primitive methods. Emma Patterson's geological expertise had evolved into systematic survey work that was mapping mineral resources throughout the Rocky Mountain region with accuracy that exceeded government geological surveys. Her detailed analysis of ore formations and mineral distributions provided information that helped small operators identify promising claims while avoiding areas where expensive development would be unlikely to produce profitable results. Emma's geological work also included environmental assessments that helped operators understand how mining activities would affect local water supplies, soil conditions, and vegetation patterns. Her research had identified development methods that minimized environmental damage while maintaining productivity, creating approaches that protected long-term agricultural and recreational value even in areas where mining was the primary economic activity. But perhaps most importantly, Emma's geological surveys were being used to develop regional development plans that coordinated mining activities with transportation infrastructure, community planning, and agricultural development in ways that maximized economic benefits while preserving environmental quality that made regions attractive for long-term settlement. Lucy Hayes had become the family's specialist in social innovation, developing programs that addressed the human costs of frontier development while creating communities that could thrive after initial economic booms ended. Her work focused on education, healthcare, and cultural activities that gave mining towns the stability and attractiveness necessary for long-term prosperity rather than temporary population concentrations that disappeared when resources were exhausted. Lucy's community development programs emphasized cooperation between different ethnic and cultural groups that often came into conflict in frontier settings where competition for employment and resources created tensions. Her approaches included cultural celebrations, cooperative business ventures, and educational programs that helped diverse populations work together productively while maintaining their distinct identities. The most innovative aspect of Lucy's Work involved developing economic structures that provided security for families during the inevitable transitions when mining operations concluded or reduced their employment. Her programs included cooperative savings plans, business development training, and alternative economic activities that could provide income when mining jobs disappeared. The expansion of their influence beyond Colorado territory brought challenges that tested their ability to maintain the family unity and cooperative values that had enabled their original success. The demands of consulting work, policy development, and technology transfer required family members to travel extensively and work with people whose priorities and methods differed significantly from their own approaches. The most serious challenge involved offers from universities, corporations, and government agencies that would have provided individual family members with lucrative careers but required them to abandon their cooperative enterprise. Sarah received offers from investment banks in New York that would have made her wealthy beyond imagination. James was invited to join engineering faculties at prestigious universities where his innovations could be developed with unlimited resources. Marcus was recruited by mining companies that wanted his management expertise for their operations. The family's decision to decline these opportunities in favor of continuing their cooperative work represented a commitment to principles that transcended individual advancement. Their choice reflected understanding that their achievements had been possible because of their unity rather than despite it, and that separating would undermine the foundation of everything they'd accomplished together. But their commitment to remaining together didn't prevent them from expanding their influence through collaborative relationships with institutions that shared their values. They established research partnerships with engineering schools, consulting relationships with reform-minded corporations, and advisory roles with government agencies that were developing policies based on their innovations. By 1871, the Thompson family's influence extended throughout the American West and beyond, affecting mining operations, government policies, educational programs, and community development initiatives from Alaska to Mexico. Their technical innovations were being used by hundreds of mining operations, their management methods were being taught in business schools, and their policy recommendations were being implemented by territorial and state governments throughout the frontier regions. But their most important legacy wasn't measured in terms of wealth generated or innovations adopted. It was the demonstration that alternative approaches to economic development could achieve superior results while maintaining values that made success meaningful. They'd proven that cooperation could triumph over competition, that sustainable practices could be more profitable than exploitative methods, and that family enterprises could accomplish things that large corporations couldn't duplicate. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction had accidentally created something that was reshaping the American economy and providing models for development that would influence frontier policy for generations. Their success had established foundations for approaches to resource development, community building, and technological innovation that proved individual initiative, when supported by appropriate cooperation and long-term vision, could accomplish extraordinary things. What they would build next would determine whether their innovations could be sustained and expanded to influence development patterns throughout the American West, or whether their achievements would remain isolated examples of what was possible under exceptional circumstances with remarkable individuals. The test of their ultimate legacy lay ahead in their ability to institutionalize their approaches in ways that would continue benefiting others long after their own direct involvement ended. 25 years after Ezra Thompson's impulsive decision to spend his last $43.60 on 7 orphan children, the remote Colorado ranch where their unlikely family had taken root had become the headquarters of the most influential enterprise in the American West. But on this autumn morning in 1892, as golden light painted the Rocky Mountains and reflected off buildings that now house the Thompson Institute for Cooperative Development, Ezra stood on the same porch where he'd first watched 7 frightened children explore their new home, contemplating a legacy that had exceeded anyone's wildest imagination. The numbers alone told an extraordinary story. The Thompson methods were being used by over 800 mining operations across North America, employing more than 50,000 workers under conditions that had set new standards for safety, compensation, and dignity throughout the extraction industries. Their technical innovations had been adopted by major corporations from Alaska to Mexico, generating licensing revenues that funded educational and community development programs in dozens of frontier towns. Most remarkably, their cooperative ownership models had created shared prosperity for thousands of families who would otherwise have remained laborers, dependent on distant corporate interests for their survival. But the true measure of what they'd accomplished couldn't be captured in statistics about profits generated or innovations adopted. They'd fundamentally altered how Americans thought about economic development, proving that competition and exploitation weren't inevitable features of capitalism, but choices that could be replaced by cooperation and mutual benefit without sacrificing efficiency or prosperity. Sarah Williams Thompson. She'd retained the family name even after her marriage to attorney Robert Harrison, a Denver lawyer who joined their enterprise after being inspired by their legal victory, had become the most influential economic policy advisor in the American West. Her recommendations were shaping legislation in 12 states and 3 territories, establishing legal frameworks that protected cooperative enterprises while encouraging innovation and sustainable development. At 38, Sarah commanded respect from business leaders, government officials, and social reformers, who recognized her as one of the most sophisticated economic minds of her generation. Her book, Cooperative Capitalism: Lessons from the American Frontier, had become required reading in universities throughout the United States and Europe, influencing a generation of economists and policymakers who were developing alternatives to both unfettered capitalism and state socialism. But Sarah's most important achievement was the establishment of the Thompson Foundation, which provided capital and technical assistance to cooperative enterprises throughout the American West. The Foundation's loan programs had enabled hundreds of family operations to implement innovations that made them competitive with large corporations, while maintaining values that prioritized worker welfare and community development. James Murphy Thompson had transformed from a mechanically gifted child into one of the most respected engineers in America, holding patents on over 200 inventions that had revolutionized not just mining but manufacturing, transportation, and agricultural equipment throughout the industrial economy. His engineering principles, emphasizing safety, efficiency, and maintainability, were being taught in technical schools from coast to coast. At 33, James directed research and development programs that employed over 400 engineers, scientists, and technicians working on innovations that addressed practical problems faced by working people in industries throughout the American economy. His laboratories in Denver, San Francisco, and Chicago were producing technologies that made dangerous jobs safer, difficult work easier, and expensive equipment more affordable for small operators who couldn't invest in large-scale industrial machinery. But James's most significant contribution was his insistence that technological development should serve human needs rather than simply increasing profits for equipment manufacturers. His open-source approach to sharing innovations ensured that improvements in working conditions and productivity benefited entire industries, rather than creating competitive advantages for companies wealthy enough to purchase exclusive rights to new technologies. Marcus Williams Thompson had become the acknowledged leader of the cooperative movement in American industry, coordinating networks of worker-owned enterprises that were demonstrating the viability of alternatives to both corporate capitalism and government ownership. His management consulting firm worked with operations throughout North America, helping family businesses and worker cooperatives Implement organizational methods that achieved remarkable productivity while maintaining democratic decision-making and equitable profit distribution. At 39, Marcus commanded respect from labor leaders and business executives, who recognized his ability to resolve conflicts that had seemed irreconcilable through conventional negotiations. His mediation services were sought by corporations dealing with labor disputes, government agencies developing employment policies, and cooperative enterprises facing internal disagreements about expansion or strategic direction. The Cooper twins, Daniel and David, had established the Thompson Manufacturing Company as one of the most innovative industrial enterprises in the American West. Their factories in Denver, Pueblo, and Colorado Springs produced mining equipment, agricultural machinery, and industrial tools that were known throughout the world for their reliability, efficiency, and innovative design. But unlike conventional manufacturing companies, Thompson Manufacturing was owned cooperatively by its workers, with profits shared according to formulas that rewarded both productivity and length of service. At 35, the twins had proven that industrial manufacturing could be organized democratically without sacrificing the technical innovation and operational efficiency that competitive markets demanded. Their factories operated with some of the highest productivity rates in American industry, while maintaining workplace safety records and employee satisfaction levels that exceeded anything achieved by conventionally managed operations. Emma Patterson. Thompson had become one of the most prominent geologists in North America, conducting surveys that had identified mineral resources worth millions of dollars while establishing environmental protection standards that preserved long-term ecological health in regions where mining activities occurred. Her geological consulting firm worked throughout the Western Hemisphere, providing assessments that helped operators maximize resource recovery while minimizing environmental damage. At 32, Emma's geological surveys had identified mineral deposits that supported sustainable extraction for decades, rather than rapid depletion that left behind environmental devastation and abandoned communities. Her methods were being used by government agencies developing natural resource policies and by private companies seeking to avoid the long-term liabilities associated with environmental destruction. Lucy Hayes Thompson had dedicated her life to social innovation, developing educational and community programs that were transforming frontier towns from temporary population concentrations into stable communities capable of long-term prosperity. Her work with children, families, and diverse cultural groups had created models for social integration that were being adopted throughout the American West and beyond. At 29, Lucy directed social services programs in over 40 communities, providing education, healthcare, and cultural activities that gave frontier settlements the stability and attractiveness necessary for continued growth after initial economic booms ended. Her approaches to resolving ethnic and cultural conflicts had been studied by government officials dealing with immigration and settlement issues throughout the rapidly expanding Western territories, but perhaps most importantly, Lucy had preserved the family culture that had made all their other achievements possible. Her insistence on regular family gatherings, shared decision-making, and mutual support had maintained the unity and cooperation that distinguished their enterprise from conventional business organizations, where individual advancement often came at the expense of collective welfare. The Thompson Institute for Cooperative Development, established on their original ranch property, had become a pilgrimage destination for reformers, entrepreneurs, and government officials seeking to understand how extraordinary achievements had emerged from such humble beginnings. The Institute's programs included technical training for engineers and managers, policy development for government officials, and leadership development for cooperative enterprises throughout North America. But the Institute's most important function was preserving and sharing the story of how 7 orphan children and a struggling rancher had created something that transformed American economic development. Their archives contained detailed documentation of every innovation, policy recommendation, and organizational method they'd developed, ensuring that future generations could learn from their experience and adapt their approaches to different circumstances and challenges. The Institute's museum attracted thousands of visitors annually who came to see the original auction receipt for $43.60 that had started everything. The simple tools James had used for his first engineering projects, the notebooks where Sarah had recorded her early business plans, and the photographs documenting their transformation from desperate individuals into a family whose achievements had influenced an entire continent. As Ezra contemplated the view from his porch on this peaceful autumn morning, he could see evidence of their influence extending in every direction. The town of Willow Creek had grown from a struggling frontier settlement into a prosperous community of over 8,000 residents, supported by diversified economic activities that provided stability and opportunity for multiple generations. The roads that connected their institute to the outside world carried a constant stream of visitors seeking to understand and replicate their innovations. But most importantly, the principles they'd discovered through necessity and developed through experience were spreading throughout American society, influencing business practices, government policies, and social relationships in ways that would continue long after their direct involvement ended. They'd proven that ordinary people, when given opportunities and supported by genuine cooperation, could accomplish extraordinary things that changed the world for the better. The telegram that arrived that afternoon brought news that completed the circle of their remarkable journey. The message, sent from the White House in Washington, D.C., contained an invitation from President Benjamin Harrison for the Thompson family to serve as advisors for a federal commission developing policies for economic development in the Western Territories. Their methods had attracted attention at the highest levels of government, which recognized their innovations as models for national development strategies. But more personally meaningful was the second telegram, which arrived an hour later from the Territorial Orphanage in Denver. 7 more children, orphaned by a mining accident in the San Juan Mountains, needed families willing to provide homes and opportunities for building meaningful lives. The orphanage director, who'd heard their story, was asking whether the Thompson family might consider adopting additional children who could benefit from the same kind of love and opportunity that had transformed 7 frightened orphans into orphans, leaders whose achievements were reshaping American society. Ezra shared both telegrams with his family during their evening meal, watching as 7 adults who'd once been desperate children considered how to respond to opportunities and responsibilities that reflected how completely their lives had been transformed. The discussion that followed revealed the same cooperative spirit and commitment to principles that had enabled their original success, but applied now to questions about their obligations to future generations and their role in shaping national development policies. The decision, when it came, was unanimous. They would accept the federal advisory positions that would allow them to influence national policy, and they would welcome 7 new children who would continue their legacy of proving that love, opportunity, and cooperation could overcome any obstacle. The poor rancher who'd bought 7 orphans at auction had accidentally discovered the most powerful force in human development, the willingness to invest in people who others had dismissed as worthless, to create opportunities where none had existed before, and to build something meaningful through shared effort and mutual support. Their story had become American legend, but more importantly, it had become American reality proof that the highest ideals of democracy and capitalism could be achieved when people chose cooperation over competition, sustainability over exploitation, and human dignity over profit maximization. 20-5 years after that desperate decision in a dusty courthouse square, Ezra Thompson could see the future extending before them with the same mixture of uncertainty and possibility that had always characterized their journey. But he faced that future with 7 remarkable adults who'd learned that anything was possible when people who cared about each other refused to accept limitations that others considered insurmountable. The history they'd made was still being written, and its final chapters would be determined by how well they could teach others to replicate the magic they discovered in choosing love over convenience, cooperation over competition, and principles over profits. The Poor Rancher and 7 Orphans had become something unprecedented in American history. A family whose achievements proved that the American dream was not just about individual success, but about what could be accomplished when individuals chose to succeed together. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.